Intramuros is valuable not only for me but for the whole of the Bureau of Treasury because it's a convergence between the distant past and the present. Over the short span that I have served as the treasurer, I have seen how, through the efforts of the Intramuros administration, places like Fort Santiago, the surrounding walls and gardens, the old churches, and the plazas have become vibrant attractions, showcasing the old alongside the new. So indeed, Intramuros is on the rise. I'm Rosalia De Leon. I'm currently the Treasurer of the Philippines and I've been working here in Intramuros since 2013. Well, personally, Intramuros is important again to me because I find solace after hard day's work. But remembering my childhood, our family would always hear masses in the Manila Cathedral, particularly during Easter Sundays. No? And just the same, there are also times when here in the Treasury, when our jobs will be very demanding, but as we see the surroundings of Intramuros, some sort of takes away, all this stress and reminds us of how lucky we are to be in this place surrounded by the history of the Philippines around us. I hope that this treasure of ours could be preserved for the generations to come. I hope that we would not be detached, so we could reach out to more people and instill in them a deep sense of our history, the richness of our culture, and a deep sense of the very rich heritage that we have inherited from our forefathers.
It was a very exciting time. That's what I remember most. I was on a holiday and I got a frantic call. Where are you anyway? They have been looking for you. And I said, what about? Having a restoration force as big as Intramuros was at the time didn't exist anywhere in the country. When we came into Intramuros to work, what are we restoring? We do not know. How did it look, except for the ruined walls? That's why we have to dig pictures and pictures and pictures just to be able to provide a background and tell people this is important, this part of the walls look like this. Everything was something that came to us by a calling, you'd say, that we have to do it right. Intramuros is a beautiful memory of the past. It is like a microcosm of all things good and bad. There are many good stories about Filipinos, people who headed the construction of the walls, and they were Indios. The carvers were Filipinos also. People should follow the regulations more, and that they should not seek exemption all the time, and this applies to both government, church, and private owners. I'm Esperanza Bunag Gatunton. I was hired, you would say, I was one of the first employed in the Intramuros administration structure, and that was pretty 1979. You have many people saying that Intramuros should not be preserved because it is a colonial memory and that should be erased. I don't think so. it represents failure. It represents achievement. So it's about time that our people should see Intramuros is not just a symbol of colonialization, but a symbol of our spirit to rise above that.
IA's dedication in ensuring that tangible treasures that immortalize our history are now accessible to the public is commendable.
Congratulations to the Intramuros administration. I wasn't expecting that the collection can be so amazing. It was really an awesome experience seeing all of this collection, and it's like 30% only of the collection. I wish to see more. Again, congratulations.
Masasabi ko ito ay malaking isang tagumpay kasi matagal namin nakatabi, nakatago at hindi na i-display talaga sa public yan. Pangalawa, nagpalipat-lipat na ng location yan at ngayon, na-save natin.
Intramuros mahalaga para sa akin bilang Pilipino kasi maraming bagay sa Pilipinas dito nagsimula sa Intramuros. Well, actually, more than reviving the structures, ang gusto ko talaga maintindihan ng tao kung anong kontribusyon ng Intramuros sa pagmuno ng Pilipinas. Kasi kung walang pagkilala, walang pagmahal, hindi siya mananatili. Fernando Siazid ako, Professor Emeritus sa Ateneo de Manila sa Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Ang mensahe ko lang, dapat mas nuanced, mas complex ang ating pagtingin sa kasaysayan. Kasi mahirap itong black and white pagtingin sa kasaysayan. Masyadong moralistic, basta Kastila masama. Dapat mas three-dimensional pagtingin sa kasaysayan.
Intramuros is important because it is one destination, tourist destination in the city of Manila. And of course, this is a historical city. It is a city within a city because the schools are here, churches are here, institution, agencies, of course, the big churches here who always support the IA, and of course the training center who are here, the hospitals are within the city of Intramuros. My wish for Intramuros is orderly, clean city, and people should be in their perspective places. Like for instance, if hopefully in a couple of months or 3 months from now, the ISF will be relocated to resettlement site in Cavite or in Bulacan, because we want them to be in the respective homes. And of course, with that, Intramuros will rise again with this movement of informal settlers. We are not removing them from here because they are part of the community. They work here. They can come, they can live here, but they have to go to their respective permanent homes after resettlement. And of course, I wish also that Intramuros will be fully developed in terms of vacant lot, property. The owners will have this plan to develop their property. here in Intramuros so that there will be no blighted areas anymore around. My name is Marieta V. Aliaga. I started working here in Intramuros in 1983, and this will be my 35th year in Intramuros administration. As Chief of the Urban Planning, I am responsible for the monitoring of construction in and around Intramuros. We are also in charge of the processing of the Intramuros Development Clearance. Intramuros should be cherished, should be loved, and should be taken care of, because Intramuros is historical. We are part of the history of the Philippines.
Ang Intramuros sa akin ay mahalaga. Ito ay naniniwala ako, ito lang ang Old Manila na siya ay nagpalago ng Metro Manila. Ito yung prime mover ng urbanization din ng Metro Manila. Kung wala yung Intramuros, wala yung Metro Manila. Kasi dito nagsimula yung malalaking eskwelahan, malalaking building, lahat ng opisina ng gobyerno. Ito lang ang lugar na may walled city o Ciudad Morada na tinatawag. Kaya nandito yung mahalagang building, tao, dito lumago. Pero no 1920 hanggang 1930, lumalabas na rin hanggang 1900, lumalabas na yung mayamang pamilya para magtayo ng malalaking bilya kasi masikip na rin Intramuros, mainit. Kailangan mag-expand, mga eskwelahan, lumabas na Intramuros. Tulad na ng UST, lumabas siya noong 1927. Tapos yung mga iba pa, Ateneo de Manila, nasunog siya noong 1932. Tapos lumabas din siya. Sana magpatuloy, tuloy-tuloy na maayos sa Intramuros. Pagdating ng present generation, maayos sa Intramuros na wala nang masyadong problema. Kasi sa ngayon may mga kakagibat pa rin problema. Nandiyan pa rin yung mga ibang informal settler na may na-relocate na kami, yung mga istansa. Siguro dadami pa ang turista sa atin kasi mabubuksan natin yung sa gitna. Tapos yung mga pavement ayos. Tapos yung mga travel ng tao, foreigner, ay mapapabilis kasi marami nagpapaliwanag. Sa ngayon, dumadami na. May bum bike na, may e-trike, may kalesa na. Marami na nag-aano sa Intramuros kasi ngayon, nagiging na to, parang tuwing may Manila tour, laging Intramuros ang priority ng Department of Tourism, Heritage. Ako nga pala si Mr. Reynaldo Cadiz, nagtatrabaho sa Intramuros ng almost 40 years, from 1979 hanggang ngayon. Naging restoration inspector din ako sa Intramuros kasi lahat ng mga ginagawang restoration, dinaanan ko from stone cutting, tapos pagbubuhos, proper document. Bago siya gawin, babaklasin muna namin yung mga lumang bato, tapos papalitan namin, mga may crack na, papalitan namin ng bago. Minsan, nung early part ng documentation namin, naglalagay din kami ng mga number sa bato para maibalik namin yung structure sa dating ayos. Napaka-importante Intramuros kasi ito yung natin eh. So, sa buhay ko napakahalaga to kasi dahil sa Intramuros nandito ako nagtrabaho 40 years, naging tanungan ako ng mga pangyayari dito na bagamat hindi ko inaabot iba, yung mga archaeology, tunnel na nahukay, mga artifacts. Tinatanong ako, mga nahukay na mass grave, halos lahat building na nirestore, kung ano ba yung mga dating opisina dito ng pre-war. Kasi nagbasa din ako ng mga libro na about sa archives namin. Tapos yung mga old photo, napakahusay ko mag-identify kasi kabisado ko yung old photo and then in new, yung pagkakaiba.
Intramuros administration, Mrs. Marcos had been interested in the restoration of Intramuros. She led the restoration of some of the gates of Intramuros. Mrs. Marcos got the engineering divisions of the different services of the military. There were lots of objections. I'd called the attention of President Marcos. So he asked me to draft a charter for Intramuros, which is what I did, and that is the Intramuros Administration Charter. The greatest satisfaction I had was the presence of a good team headed by Mrs. Esperanza Gatmonton, and in the early days also Felix Imperial, because basically the three of us were the ones who set the initial directions of the Intramuros administration. It's important because it's part of our history, part of our heritage, one of the few physical evidences remaining of the Spanish period of Philippine history. I think the major development since that time was the proliferation of informal settlers. And it seems to me that the proper and humanitarian relocation of those informal settlers is critical to the future progress of Intramuros. I'm Jaime Laya, and I think the directions of the development of Intramuros embodied in the administration charter continue to be relevant.
Well, Intramuros for me is many things because my father used to work in the port area, in Bonifacio Drive in port area. So even as a small boy, I really knew Intramuros already back in the 50s. And I was very happy to have been appointed administrator in 1989. And that really involved me more with the history of Intramuros and the plans for its further development. It would be very important that we know where we came from, and I think that's the special value of Intramuros. But even in modern times, there could be or there should be, and as it's happening now, other developments here in Intramuros. I'm Jose Capistrano Jr., formerly administrator of Intramuros. Well, as what's happening now, Escuela Taller assists in the restoration of heritage structures through our training of out-of-school youth in the various arts and crafts of heritage restoration. And I think this is important to preserve our historical and heritage structures, and at the same time also reach out to other parts of the country for the same purpose.
If you're looking at Intramuros from the perspective of history, it's one place where you could actually see the history of the Philippines as it unfolded. I see that Intramuros is an area which can embody the concept of reuse in urban planning. So just think of old structures being utilized in a modern sense. I think the challenge for us in IA is how can we recreate the former ambience so that people can relive history through Intramuros. And then that's where it becomes a site where we can educate people on the version of history according to the Filipinos. So I'm Roberto Alabado III, and currently I'm the Assistant Secretary for Tourism Development Planning. And it's fantastic to have an urban area, an old urban area, wherein the maybe in our generation we can see this transformed into a more developed society where poverty will no longer exist within the walls of Intramuros.
Intramuros for me is, I would say, the soul of our country. My name is Paulo Mercado. I'm the founder and president of the Creative Economy Council of the Philippines. This is an advocacy group that we set up about 2 years ago to promote the creative industries, both in the public and private sector. So, yung concept of creative economy essentially is taking a look at the contribution of the totality of creative industries and creative individuals to the national economy. So, and to our thrust is to get the government to recognize it as a priority strategic sector and support it with, let's say, incentives or from the private sector investments that would make it grow faster. So I wish for Intramuros in the near future to become the country's most iconic creative hub.
Ang ano ko po sa Intramuros isang makasaysayang lugar. Kasi dito nagkaroon ng digmaan. Yun din yung natutunan ko sa eskwelahan. Sa akin sir, ang laki po ng naitulong ng eskwela atelier kasi nung una po na hindi pa ako nakapasok dito, high school graduate lang ako, nahirapan ako maghanap ng trabaho. So nung nakita ko na mag-opening sila na kailangan nila ng trainees, so pumasok ako yun. Tapos pagka-graduate ko, binigyan nila ako ng opportunity na magtrabaho sa mga heritage site. Ako po si Christian Edward Aguirre. Bali, instructor po ako ngayon ng masonry workshop dito sa Eskwela Atelier. Ang laki ng tulong, unang-una doon sa paninirahan. Mayroon kaming matitirahan sa loob. Dito ako nakatira. Sana po mas tumibay pa ang komunidad dito sa loob.
Intramuros was the biggest European city in Asia. It defines our culture. The problem is most of our officials do not appreciate it.
It's important because it's part of our history, part of our heritage, and one of the few physical evidences remaining of the Spanish period of Philippine history.
There are many good stories about Filipinos, people who headed the construction of the walls. The carvers were Filipinos also. It was a very exciting time. That's what I remember most, having a restoration force as big as Intramuros was at the time. Well, didn't exist anywhere in the country. When we came into Intramuros to work, what are we restoring? We do not know. How did it look, except for the ruined walls? That's why we have to dig pictures and pictures and pictures just to be able to provide a background.
And in the early days, it was really a dead town. Even when Casa Manila was finished, we would make whatever pakulo.
Welcome everybody to the 23rd episode of the Intramuros Learning Sessions. Our topic for today is about the Burnham Plan of Manila and the Frost Plan of Quezon City. Now, before we proceed with our webinar, I would like to announce some reminders first. So if you'd like to ask questions, you may send it to the Q&A button, which is found in the lower portion of the screen. If you're viewing via Facebook, you may send your questions in the comment section. Please note that we will do our best to accommodate all of the questions. Only those who have successfully registered and viewed on Zoom will be eligible to get a certificate. A feedback form will be emailed to you after the session, and a certificate will be sent within a week. If you are unable to attend the webinar, please let us know now so we can give the slot to another registrant. Ensure that your audio is okay. Wear your reliable set of headphones. Don't be shy to ask questions, and most importantly, get yourself comfortable and enjoy. Now, I'd like to call on the Administrator of Intramuros, Attorney Einsiedel, who will introduce for us today our guest speaker. Administrator.
Good afternoon, everyone, and we welcome you again to another episode of the Intramuros Learning Sessions. Since March, because of the current public health crisis, there has been much discussion regarding the value of urban planning, proper urban planning. So we are fortunate that for this afternoon, we have a professional urban planner and who is highly acknowledged in the field to be our main speaker for this afternoon. So Dr. Nathaniel von Einsiedel is an urban planner. He holds a master's degree from the Columbia University on urban planning, aside from his BS in architecture from the University of the Philippines. He also holds a Ph.D. in Public Administration and Urban Management from the Pacific Western University. He is the founding commissioner for planning of the former Metro Manila Commission, which is the precursor of the Metro Manila Development Authority. He also served as the president of the Heritage Conservation Society. So for this afternoon, we look forward to an interesting discussion on urban planning, highlighting two plans that are of value and of significance. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 23rd episode of the Intramuros Learning Sessions.
Thank you, Administrator, for that introduction. Now I'd like to call on Dr. Einsiedel for his presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Mr. Asido, for the introduction. Okay, for this afternoon, I wanted to share information about the Burnham plan, Daniel Burnham's plan for Manila, and also the Frost and Arellano plan for Quezon City, focusing both on capital. Both Manila and Quezon City were capital cities. Okay, let me try and share my screen. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I won't put it on slide mode so that I can go back and forth easier in case there are questions along the way. Okay, so the topic I titled it the Burnham plan for Manila and the Frost-Arellano plan for Quezon City. What worked, what did not, and why? Okay, my presentation, I've divided it into 4 parts. The first part, I'll talk about the Burnham plan, its features and the context for its preparation. And then part 2 is the 1941 and actually also 1949 update of the Frost-Arellano plan for Quezon City. Again, I will present its main features and its context. Part 3, I'll discuss why there were certain elements of these two plans that were implemented and why there were also certain elements. And then part 4 is I'll make some concluding remarks regarding the two plans. Okay. So going to the Burnham plan. First of all, I thought I'd like to give you a little bit of background of who Daniel Hudson Burnham plan is. He was the acknowledged premier architect, city planner in the US in the early 1900s. And he was known for his plan for updating the L'Enfant plans for Washington, D.C., the plans he made for Chicago and San Francisco, and I believe he also did the plan for Cleveland. So he was actually doing the San Francisco plan when he was invited to come to Manila. He was an active proponent of the City Beautiful movement during the 1890s to the 1990s. And he was invited by the Governor General, William Howard Taft, in late 1904 to come to the Philippines to make plans for Baguio and Manila. So he came to the Philippines with architect Pierce Anderson. He stayed only for 6 weeks, including his visit to Baguio, and returned to the US and prepared the plan for Manila and Baguio over the following 6 months. In late 1905, he presented his plan, which contained 5 elements. So let me now go to the 5 elements of the Burnham Plan. The first is the development of the waterfront, parks and parkways, which included, of course, Luneta, as we now know it, which was envisioned as the center, the American government center. Part of the plan was the 76-meter wide Seaside Boulevard, originally called Cavite Boulevard, later became Dewey Boulevard, and then presently known as Rojas Boulevard. In his plan was a system of parks and parkways. It included 9 active playfields and 4 large green open spaces along the perimeter of the city. I'd like you to remember this particular point about the 9 active playfields and 4 large green open spaces, because I'll mention this again later on. The second element was a street system which was overlaid in what was existing at that time. Okay? It consisted of radiating boulevards connecting the different civic centers. The civic centers was viewed by Burnham as the central organizers of cities. And this was really part of, or it comes from the City Beautiful movement. Later on, I will show you a plan where the city of Manila somehow was patterned after. The central civic core in the Manila plan that Burnham prepared is similar to the National Mall in Washington, D.C., where the government is the focus. And as I mentioned earlier, Burnham was known for updating the plan for Washington, D.C. that was originally prepared by the French architect planner Pierre L'Enfant. But in the early 1900s, Burnham updated that plan. The third element of the Burnham plan consisted of the location of a number of important buildings. One of this is the world-class resort hotel, which we now know as Manila Hotel. There were also a number of other buildings. There was a courthouse, several government buildings, a library, a museum, and a railway station. For those of you who may be familiar with Tutuban, that was part of the Burnham plan. And interestingly, also part of his proposal was to locate schools in Santa Mesa Heights. The fourth element in the plan was the development of the Pasig River as a transportation canal. And the river banks of the Pasig River to be developed as shaded boulevards. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with some of these boulevards and the fact that we do have a Pasig River ferry transport system, although I think it stopped for a while, but I think it's being revived by MMDA. But what is interesting is that Burnham recognized the value of waterways as vital to the city's economy. Also, what is interesting is that he developed the bayfront, which is Rojas Boulevard as we now know it, with that wide setback from the water, between the water and the road, because he saw this as what he called a natural theater of social life. Another interesting feature in this Burnham plan is that he recommended the expropriation of lands beside rivers and esteros and to develop this as open space, mainly as easements to prevent or to accommodate, to prevent buildings from being built right next to it that were likely to get flooded when during heavy rains. The fifth element, but we could not find any details on this, was the development of summer resorts in the provinces of Laguna and Bataan. I just showed here a map that showed Rojas Boulevard, or what before was Dewey Boulevard, that you will see extends from Rizal Park all the way to Cavite. That was part of the Burnham plan, although it was not proposed as a reclamation, as a reclaimed road. Now here's a quotation from Burnham of what he envisioned the plan for Manila was. He was likening Manila to having the Bay of Naples, the River of Paris, and the canals of Venice. And so he saw in this the opportunity that was unique to create a unified city equal to the greatest city of the Western world, but with the addition of a tropical setting. So this is lifted from the report that was written by Burnham, which he presented in 1905. Let me now go into the context of the Burnham Plan. The Americans saw the Philippines as a laboratory. The Americans came to the Philippines and they saw the Philippines being as a laboratory, a space where they could do experiments and ideas with practically no resistance, no oversight, or no consequences. The Philippines was a colony. The Americans felt they could do just about anything they wanted to do. For Daniel Burnham, this meant the Philippines, or Manila, was a blank canvas, an opportunity to introduce the ideas that he had dreamt of in the U.S., but without the issues or the problems of having to negotiate with citizens, with businessmen, and with politicians. There were no voters for him to persuade. So there was no consultation with anybody. He just came up with a plan. As I said, he was just here for 6 days. And when he returned to the US, he had 6 months to prepare the plan. And he was just doing this all alone. Burnham's assignment was to prepare a plan for Manila that would reflect America's growing status in world affairs. So meaning the Americans wanted to project Manila as something that was a creation of the Americans and to demonstrate the power that they had. And to achieve this assignment, Burnham used the City Beautiful concept. The City Beautiful movement was a cultural, aesthetic, political, and environmental movement. It embodied the aspirations of the U.S., of America, in reshaping its cities into beautiful, orderly, and healthy places to live in. The layout, as shown by this drawing here, by the way, this map here on the right is a map drawn by Burnham for what was supposed to be a large park in Harrison. This was never implemented. But it's the layout, as you will notice, emphasized symmetry and order. It identified where the buildings should be located, and the positioning of buildings were designed in such a way that they would really be easily recognizable from a distance, and that it would inspire people when they see them. The only part of this plan that was implemented is that little park in front of Malati Church. and beside the Aristocrat restaurant, if you're familiar with that area. But the rest of the plan was not implemented. The Americans also set up a national legislature, and I think it was called the Philippine Assembly. And then they introduced a system of popularly elected local government officials. Okay. The problem, however, is that the Americans did little to alter the grossly inequitable and unjust socioeconomic structure that was left behind by the Spaniards. In 1904, when Burnham started the plan for Manila in late 1904, Manila was just recovering from many years of war with the Spaniards. It also experienced an epidemic and a big fire that left about 8,000 people homeless. But instead of addressing these issues, the Americans focused more on the establishment of government buildings as focal points, the civic centers. And it's very similar to what the previous Spaniards did, but the Spaniards used the church in coming up with a spatial organization where you have the plaza in front of the church and you have the government buildings on the sides, etc. While the Spaniards did that, the Americans used government buildings as the spatial sort of manner of creating urban spaces. One of the things that the Americans did not do was to return the friar lands to the original Filipino owners, which, if you remember your Philippine history, was the main reason for the Philippine Revolution against Spain. The friar lands that were confiscated by the short-lived Philippine Republic were returned to the religious orders instead of their original Filipino landowners. And so even as early as that, the problem of land was a major issue. Now, as Manila remained the colonial capital, a lot of American officials, soldiers, teachers, businessmen flocked into the city. And this resulted in a widespread construction of roads and bridges, ports, parks, recreation areas, social clubs, bars, and other attractions that Americans were accustomed to. By the way, there was nothing Filipino in the Burnham plan. It was an American. It was a plan made for Americans. At the time, the UP had been established, and a number of private schools by Spanish religious orders were also established, further enhancing Manila's prominence as the country's educational center. Now, with the number of tertiary schools and education becoming an avenue for social mobility, Manila became a magnet for students from other parts of the country. And also the city became a magnet for migrants because public works, roads, bridges, hospitals, clinics, sanitation was improved, etc., etc. So a lot of improvements were done, and this attracted a lot of migrants from the surrounding regions looking for a better place to live and also for looking for jobs. So the migration into Manila started as early as in the early 1900s. The problem was that this rapid rise in population resulted in slums and informal settlements because the friar lands were not returned to the original owners. So many a lot of the people were squatting in different places. So the problem of slums and informal settlements were already major issues even at that time. Now, the implementation of the Burnham Plan. Burnham, because he only was here for 6 weeks and then he prepared the plan over 6 months, he recommended William Parsons to implement the Manila and Baguio plans. So Parsons came to the Philippines. He arrived in Manila in November of 1905, just a few months after Burnham had submitted the plan. And he assumed, Parsons assumed the newly created post of consulting architect. He was sort of under the what is now the DPWH. What that office was before, I can't remember the name, but now it's the DPWH. Parsons refined and detailed both the Manila and Baguio plans, but made very, very minor changes to Burnham's original layout. Basically, Parsons just filled in a few blanks, and he concentrated more in designing buildings because he was an architect as well, and so he preferred to design buildings. So what were implemented in the Burnham Plan? Well, the Seaside Parkway, what we now know as Ross Boulevard, Luneta or Rizal Park, the agriculture and finance buildings, the government buildings, the legislative building, which is now the National Museum. The Manila City Hall was part of the Burnham Plan. The Central Post Office was also part of the Burnham Plan. So those were built. Manila Hotel was built. The Army-Navy Club was built. And 5 of the 9 proposed active sports fields were also built. And then a number of other major roads and bridges were built. So you will see here on the right the post office building and the original Jones Bridge as viewed in the early 1900s. And then Ross Boulevard without the traffic in the 1940s. What were not implemented? Now take a look at this plan on the right. And with the help of architect Paulo Alcazaren, we came up with this plan, and we highlighted in green the 4 large parks in the perimeter. So if you start from the left, in the vicinity of Tondo, there was supposed to be a large park. And then as you go up to the north, you see another large park. And then you move to the right by the Pasig River, where there's that bend, there's another park. And then to the right, I think that's the Harrison Park. None of these 4 parks were implemented. The Capitol complex, where the supposedly sort of an expansion of the Agripina Circle, that was also not built. The Governor General's residence along Manila Bay, which was supposed to have been located somewhere closer to the Pasay area, was not built. And therefore, Malacanang became the official presidential palace, even though Malacanang was intended to only be a temporary residence of the Governor General. Also, what was not implemented, and this I'd like to emphasize, the expropriation of the private lands adjacent to the Pasig River and Esteros were not implemented. This was not implemented. In fact, many of the esteros disappeared. Now let me proceed to the Frost-Arellano plan for Quezon City. Now Quezon, as you probably know, President Manuel Quezon, in 1938 asked William Parsons actually to make a plan for the new capital. President Quezon did not like Manila to be the capital. He felt it was. He was advised by some of his advisors that Manila was not a good place for a capital because it was vulnerable to seaside attacks from Manila Bay. And also, it was already congested. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of slums and informal settlements had already sprouted in Manila, and therefore, Quezon wanted to make another capital. And so he asked Parsons. At that time, Parsons was serving as the architectural advisor to the government, working as an assistant to William Parsons. When Harry Frost took over Parsons in preparing the plan for Quezon City, he teamed up with Juan Arellano, engineer Alpheus Williams, and landscape architect and planner Louis Croft. And they made a grand master plan for the new capital of the Philippines. Now, I wanted to also highlight the role of Juan Arellano here. Okay, let me point out the last bullet. Okay. So he joined. Arellano was a scholar of the Philippine government. He was sent to the U.S. to study, and he was trained in the Beaux-Arts. And he worked with, what is interesting, he worked with the landscape architect planner Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed the Central Park in New York. So Arellano had a strong landscape architecture influence as well, aside from his Beaux-Arts training. He's famous for having designed the Manila Post Office, the Metropolitan Theater, the Legislative Building, which is now the National Museum, and many others. He also designed the Capitol Building in Negros, which you will find in Bacolod. Now, what were the major elements of the Frost-Arellano plan? Number one was a national government center. Oh, by the way, before I proceed, before Quezon City became Quezon City, there was no Quezon City. There was no separate city that existed that was renamed Quezon. Actually, Quezon City was was a collection of donations from 7 other towns and cities, including Manila. Manila donated what is now the part of La Loma in Quezon City. It also, Caloocan donated what is now Novaliches. San Mateo and Montalban also donated some parts, which is now part of that Fairview area. Pasig also donated, which is the Camp Crame and what's that subdivision there? Anyway, that area, Green Meadows subdivision, and San Juan also donated a little bit, and Mandaluyong also donated anyway. So the 7 LGUs that donated land, that created Quezon City, were just so happy to donate because they were all in support of Quezon's idea of creating a new capital. Okay. So element number one in the Frost-Arellano plan for Quezon City is a government center, which is located in and around what is now known to all of us as the Quezon City Memorial Circle. The original plan was the legislature was to be inside the circle. The presidential palace was supposed to be on its left, what is now the Veterans Memorial Hospital. And the Supreme Court complex is supposed to be on its right, which is now the East Avenue Medical Center and the Heart Center. In 1949, when the plan was updated, the National Government Center was proposed to be moved, to be relocated to Batasan Hills. Okay, I'll discuss that a little bit later. So that was the National Government Center was the first element. The second element was a central park, what is known as the Diliman Quadrangle. And these were in both the 1941 and 1949 plans. Quezon City was envisioned by Frost and Arellano to be a garden city. As I mentioned, Frost and Arellano were both influenced by landscape architects. And they recommended, they proposed that a central park be built as the heart, in the heart of the city. And it was the central park was to be the heart of a park system. Excuse me. And this was supposed to be situated in the Diliman Quadrangle. Now, please take note, there was supposed to be a park situated in the Diliman Quadrangle, bounded by the north, west, east, and south avenues. It was devoted exclusively to park facilities and recreational activities. I'll come back to this point later. The entire northern part of the quadrangle was reserved for a botanical and zoological garden. The southwestern quarter was supposed to be a municipal golf course, while the southeastern quarter was for a national stadium and sports center. A major feature, of course, of the plan was the Quezon Memorial Circle itself. The 1941 plan proposed that the circle house the Capitol building, which was supposed to be the national legislature. But as I said, in 1949, the plan was changed, and that it was proposed that the large building be built in the Oval to accommodate most of the executive departments, and some of these departments can be located or were proposed to be located on the sides. The Quezon Memorial was actually to be built on the left side of the Oval, presently occupied by the Veterans Memorial Hospital. Another major element of the plan was the Quezon City Hall site. But it was supposed to be its site is now occupied by the East Avenue Medical Center. It was meant to be further away, but anyway, it is now the original site is now occupied by the East Avenue Medical Center, which was originally in the 1941 plan supposed to be the site of the Supreme Court. Both plans, 1941 and 1949, proposed a civic center with a public library, an auditorium, and a theater beside the City Hall. There was also, element number 5, a national exposition grounds. Now, please remember that this was during the time of the Philippine Commonwealth. and the Philippines was already about to gain its independence. And so there was a proposal that the World Trade Fair be held in the Philippines. And so part of the Frost-Arellano plan was a 46-hectare national exposition grounds proposed to be on the left of the Veterans Memorial uh, Medical Center at the northwest corner of the Diliman Triangle, which presently is occupied by SM City North. The 1949 plan proposed also a scientific government center adjacent to the Expo grounds, and it was supposed to house the Bureau of Soils and the Bureau of Plant Industry and several other offices devoted to science and technology. The original site of the Veterans Memorial Medical Center was supposed to be across the exposition grounds on the left side of EDSA, which is now what is Film Live Homes. Are you imagining the location of these places? I hope you are. So you'll remember, what were in the plan, and later on we'll discuss why things happened and why some things did not. There were also a number of four actually major commercial centers that were proposed. The only one that is probably recognizable is what is now known as the Cubao Business District. There were other commercial centers that were proposed, but these did not materialize. Industrial zones were proposed in the northeast outskirts of the city, which is actually where Novaliches, and which is actually also an industrial area now. There were also a number of major thoroughfares. There was the Republic Avenue, which was envisioned as a parkway, and it was supposed to eventually connect to Rojas Boulevard. It was envisioned to serve as a principal showplace, but only part of it was constructed. There were a lot of other major roads that were constructed, some of which are very familiar. EDSA, originally known as Liberation Avenue, Malaya Avenue, which is now Magsaysay Boulevard, the Katipunan Avenue, Congressional Avenue, Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao Avenues. What was also implemented in the Frost-Arellano plan was UP. Although the University of the Philippines actually was already established even before the plan was made. Although the campus, the Diliman campus, did not materialize until about 1939 or 1940. No, actually, it materialized only in 1949 after the Second World War. But the plan, in fact, the two oldest buildings in UP, the College of Law and the College of Education, were designed by Parsons in 1938 when he made the plan for the UP. Also, part of the Frost-Arellano plan were the housing projects. There were 8 master plan housing projects. These were planned residential neighborhoods where each one was supposed to have a civic center. It was supposed to have a service corps with school, shops, and open spaces. So these were the elements of the Frost-Arellano plan. Let me now go into the context of the plan. Okay, the establishment of the Commonwealth government in 1938 brought with it pressure on President Manuel Quezon to abandon the Burnham plan and to move the capital somewhere else. And this was supposedly because of fears of a seaside attack in Manila, on Manila, and the increasing congestion of the Manila Central Business District. At that time, and this was in the mid-1930s, Manila's urban problems were already apparent and alarming. Sanitation and traffic congestion were critical problems. But the most pressing problem was the housing crisis, as thousands of residents lived in congested slums, particularly in the areas of Binondo, Quiapo, San Nicolas, Tondo, and Intramuros. And this condition became a disincentive for Filipino politicians to invest more in creating a government center in Manila. The conditions in Manila also spurred the development of the suburbs outside of the city limits without any plan to guide it. So even at that time, the problem of urban sprawl already started. The 1939 Commonwealth Act authorized the move of the capital city outside of Manila. And in the summer of 1939, Quezon asked William Parsons not just to prepare a plan for Quezon City, but to choose a site where the new capital was supposed to go up. Parsons eventually chose a 1,572 hectare plot known as the Diliman Estate. Okay. Parsons died in December of 1939, and his former partner, Harry Frost, took over. The new capital, at that time, Quezon City was non-existent. It was not known as Quezon City. The new capital started with the purchase of the large tract, the Diliman Estate, which was owned by the Tuason family. But Quezon envisioned to democratize the landed estates, and the 6 other estates were acquired by government. Santa Mesa Estate, Mandaluyong Estate, Magdalena Estate, Piedad Estate, etc. And these were all expropriated by government, and this constituted the initial area that was subsequently to be known as Quezon City. The intended beneficiaries of this plan were supposed to be Manila's working class. That's why you remember there were 8 housing projects that was included in the plan. And Quezon's vision was to offer decent housing and affordable housing in the new capital. Quezon made this as a promise that he would provide the residents of the new housing estates with basic services, with markets, with schools, and with transportation. The foundations of this new capital were laid out in 1938 when a portion of the new estate was allotted for housing for government workers known as Barrio Obrero, present day now Kamuning, what we know now as Kamuning. So Frost-Arellano and the other guys prepared the plan for Quezon City. And the plan, if you look into it, is actually an expansion of the original City Beautiful pattern set by Burnham for Manila. It had a grand civic center, it had parks and parkways, it had a strong axial geometric pattern for building groups and parks. Now, the photo on the right shows some of the projects. I'm not sure whether you can read it, but Project 7 is located here. Project 3 is here. Project 4 is here. I don't know where the other projects are, but in this map, it shows you how wide, how expansive the area was. The plan for Quezon City, the plan for Quezon City was actually also a city beautiful plan. It followed the city beautiful concept. And it bore the influences of succeeding planning movements. It added, by the way, also some other elements aside from just being city beautiful. Arellano introduced the idea of including land use, and Frost and Arellano also paid more attention to roadway planning. So it was not just main boulevards and avenues, but also a network of other roads. The original plan was completed in 1941, but then the Second World War broke out, and then also Quezon died while in the U.S., and the pursuit of the new capital lost steam. In 1946, the newly elected President Manuel Rojas created the Capital State Commission, and the plan that Frost and Arellano prepared was revised. And this was revised in 1947, again in 1949, and submitted to then President Elpidio Quirino later in 1949. One interesting note: in December of 1928, Arellano wrote to Quezon opposing the Burnham plan and advocating putting up the government center in Marikina Heights. It's an interesting sidelight. I thought I should just mention it for people who live in Marikina, that Marikina almost became the government center. Now, implementing the Frost-Arellano plan. What were implemented? Only the Batasan in the planned Constitution Hill. All the other buildings and all the other areas there were not implemented. Remnants of the Central Park are only the 19-hectare Ninoy Aquino Park and Wildlife Center and a mini forest between the Central Bank Mint and the Lung Center. What was built also was of course, the Quezon Circle, which we know very well. The buildings on one side of the circle, you have the Department of Agriculture, again, for the NR. I can't remember the others, but anyway, that was part of the plan where the executive offices were supposed to be located. Most of the major avenues were also implemented, but only part of Republic Avenue was implemented. The 8 planned neighborhood units, or the projects 1 to 8, were implemented. Now, what were not implemented? The Presidential Palace, which was supposed to be in what is now the Veterans Memorial Hospital site, that was not implemented. The Supreme Court was not implemented, and both of these places still are in Manila. The Central Park was drastically reduced numerous times. The Capitol building to house the Philippine legislature in the 1941 plan, that was not implemented. The Executive Center in the Quezon Circle and in the Quezon Circle were also not implemented. The National Exposition Grounds were not implemented. The planned business centers were not implemented. The Cubao area was developed as a private enterprise. That government had nothing to do with that. The business district in La Mesa Dam, and there was another one that was near the Heart Center, that was not implemented. Please note that Quezon City served as the country's capital from 1949 up to 1975. So it served as the capital of the Philippines for that long a period of time. It was reverted back to Manila in 1975 by then President Marcos. Here is a quotation from Quezon of his vision for Quezon City. As you will see, he tried to make it as inspiring as possible. So we now move on to the third part, which is why the two plans were not fully implemented. Okay, there was one, the apparent lack of interface between planning and financing. The projects were designed mainly on the basis of political wishes and did not consider financial viability. Another is that both plans were central government driven. They did not appear to have involved key stakeholders, including the two local governments, Manila and Quezon City itself. Okay, it's excusable in the part of Quezon City because there was no Quezon City yet. But Manila was not consulted during the Burnham, the preparation of the Burnham plan. Also, the Burnham plan as well as the Frost-Arellano plan were too narrowly focused on physical design and aesthetics. Hardly any attention to pressing socio-economic issues at that time. They kind of pushed aside the issues of slums and informal settlements. Luneta, the focal point of the Burnham plan, is on land that is owned and controlled by the national government, which the city of Manila has no control over, even though the majority of the users of Luneta are Manila residents. Of course, in the case of the Frost-Arellano plan, it was derailed by the Second World War and the death of Quezon. And somehow the need, the pressure to reconstruct after the war sort of undermined the proper implementation of the plan. The major elements of the Frost-Arellano plan are similarly located on national government-owned and controlled land, which the Quezon City government has no control over. Also, implementation of the plan, and this is very important in understanding what happened to Quezon City. It was undermined by the parceling of the land by government offices, encroachment by squatters, and bureaucratic neglect. Parceling the area to the BIR, the Mint, the SSS, and a lot of those other buildings. The pamantasan ng the Philippine Science High School. Also, full implementation of both plans were undermined by financial constraints, lack of political will, and corruption. Now, let me just make a few closing remarks. I would say that full implementation of the Burnham plan for Manila, and more especially the Frost-Arellano plan for Quezon City, were both undermined by greed. The Quezon City started with a bang, with the Frost-Arellano plan providing a vision of a great capital city. And they said it was a national capital center to rival those in Canberra and Brasilia. But in the 1950s, the original quadrangle was cut in half. The west and south triangles were sold off to housing developers. So you now have Film Life Homes, uh, and then you now have GMA and the ABS-CBN in those areas. And then in the 1960s, the remaining land was even cut up further to accommodate the Philippine Science High School. And in the 1970s, what remained were parceled off to various other government offices and institutions. More recently, even the few remaining government-owned parcels have been bid out to private real estate developers. Picture on the top is Trinoma. What is left of the original 400 hectares park is now just 25 hectares of the Quezon Memorial Circle and the Ninoy Aquino Parks and Wildlife Center. None of the intended parks and parkway systems were ever built. In the process, Quezon City has turned into one big dormitory for employees and workers who commute daily to offices in Makati, Manila, Mandaluyong, etc. So I just thought I'd show a picture of the EDSA traffic that we experience on a daily basis. Political ambitions have spatial dimensions, and these are often cast in the form of cities. Nation states need cities as embodiments of their power, just like what the US wanted through the Burnham Plan. So the capital city, Manila, Quezon City, occupy an exalted space within the geopolitical body of the nation. But capital cities are also invested with the symbolic capital in the form of architecture and city planning. Manila was a colonial city, while Quezon City was an imagined city for a nation that was about to change from being a colony to a sovereign nation state. The problem was that both the Burnham and the Frost-Arellano plans narrowly focused only on the physical aspects of the two cities. So while Manila was the creation of Spain and subsequently enhanced by America, Quezon City was an articulation of Filipino nationalism. However, the Burnham Plan and the Frost-Arellano Plan were both overly focused on physical order and aesthetics. If we are to better understand the cities, we have to go beyond the wide avenues, the celebratory monuments and parks, and determine whether these cities work for the people who live and work in them. That's my presentation. Thank you very much. So I think we can open now the session to questions and answers. Let me just
Yes, sir.
turn off my screen.
Thank you so much, sir, for the presentation. So we're now proceeding with the question time. So before anything else, let me remind our viewers that everyone is encouraged to raise their questions. If you are viewing via Zoom, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So just raise your questions in the Q&A button. We will only entertain questions via that button. And if you're viewing via Facebook, you can raise your questions in the comment section below. So feel free to ask your questions. So, right, sir. So our first question is from Zoom. This one is from Christopher Pasion. Thank you for the very insightful lecture. With all the unimplemented, the question is, with all the unimplemented urban planning that you have presented, are any of the plans salvageable? Can we make any urban planning Filipino-centric? And do you have any proposals and examples?
Okay, well, when we speak of planning, we have to make a distinction between the term plan and planning. Burnham prepared a plan, okay? Frost and Arellano prepared plans. It is different when you say urban planning, which is a continuous process, non-stop. In other words, that's why it's a government function. That's why you have city planning offices. Their work is continuing. What was done by Burnham and Frost and Arellano were plans that were supposed to be implemented at that time. Um, but while in the case of the Burnham plan, it was hardly modified from what was originally prepared, because the one who was assigned to update it or to implement the plan was Parsons, and Parsons concentrated just on building buildings and designing buildings, so that nothing happened. In the case of the Frost plan, Arellano updated it in 1949, but they were overrun by events, and then nothing happened subsequently. Nobody picked it up. Now, supposedly, if Quezon City became a city at that time, it should have had a city planning office, which should have continued on the work. Uh, uh, I'm not familiar, however, with what was done with the plan after Quezon City became a city. But as you know, up to now, uh, there are still city planning offices both in Manila and in Quezon City, and what they do is continuing planning work, and they update the plans, or they're supposed to update the plans on a regular basis. And the plans uh, now that are being done by Manila and Quezon City are not just limited to the physical and aesthetic aspects. They now cover a much broader field. When you take a look at the concept of sustainable development, then you need to take a look at the social, the economic, and environmental. So it's not just all physical. It's a combination and a balancing act between all of those things. To the question about what is salvageable, well, actually, what you see on the ground are remnants of the plan. So, in a sense, I guess you can say those were salvaged. I mean, it was implemented. So, you see remnants of that plan. Now, how do you Philippinize the plan? Well, first of all, the city planning offices now are manned by Filipinos. I mean, you cannot, a foreigner cannot work for government. So they're all Filipinos, and supposedly they know what they're supposed to do. So that's a way, I guess, of making sure that the plans are suited to our local culture. Our There's still a lot of things that are missing, in my view, um, but it has something to do also with our culture. For example, we have a term in Tagalog, kapitbahay, which means neighbor. But we do not have a Tagalog word for neighborhood. For example, meron ba? Does anybody know? Is a barangay a neighborhood? Personally, I don't think so. I think it's too big. I think it's too populous. To me, a neighborhood is a place where I know who my neighbors are. Anyway, so may mga ganong missing elements in our practice of in the practice of urban planning, and so there is a tendency that we get influenced by what we read about from other countries, and we tend to, sort of adopt many of these ideas coming from other countries in the plans that we prepare. Anyway, I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is from Facebook. Since aesthetics was the focus, was there any intention toward architectural uniformity in the Frost plan? Was there any style plan that was prepared?
I am not aware of any style plan that was prepared. I think it was focused mainly on the layout, or the kind of like the master. I guess you can call it a master plan. The layout, it did not go into the specific styles. I think the styling of buildings were pretty much left to the individual architects who designed the individual buildings. So, for example, in the case of the what you now see in the Batasan, that was designed by architect Felipe Mendoza, and it's supposed to be a Filipino-inspired design. So, the styling, I think, was pretty much left to the individual architects to come up with.
Thank you, sir. This one is from Emelita Samala. Sir, do you think that the plan was too grand for Filipinos to take care or handle? Was there any criticism that it was too much?
Well, it was grand. I think if you take a look at the scale of what was being done, it was a grand plan. But you need a plan for the entire city, so you need to cover quite a lot of ground. Now, how you translate a plan for an entire city and bring it down to the level of a neighborhood requires planning at different scales. So you come up with a grand plan. The problem with a grand plan is that it is very often a top-down plan. It comes mainly from the national government, and it is imposed just like the two plans, the Burnham plan and the Frost-Arellano plan. They were national government decided plans, and they were imposed on the places where they were supposed to be implemented. And there was no participation from the lower level. For example, you cannot, even the housing projects in Quezon City, projects 1 to 8, those were planned centrally by the national government. There was no participation at all by the people who were supposed to live in those places. You cannot do that now. In an inhabited city, what you need to do is actually redevelopment. In which case, there are people living there already that you need to consult with. So it's an entirely kind of a mix of a master plan that is kind of broad and covers quite a lot of ground. Let's say for the entire city, you need a citywide plan, but you also need a neighborhood plan. And in the neighborhood plan is where you have local residents contributing their ideas as to what it is that they would like to happen in their neighborhood, especially if it's an existing neighborhood.
Thank you, sir. Our next one is from Joven Acoldia from Zoom. What is your opinion on the recently passed National Museum Act that mandates the building of the remaining Burnham Plan buildings in the Agrifina cluster? Does building the edifices today undermine the current function of the park as an open space? Moreover, it was revealed that the NPDC and the National Museum proposed to move the facade of the Paco railway station to Rizal Park and repurpose it as an arch. What is your opinion on the displacement of this kind of adaptive reuse of the Burnham plan buildings?
Uh, that's a pretty complicated question. Uh, I don't think that the plan to repurpose or to um, adaptively reuse the government buildings in the Agrivina Circle um, conflicts with the idea of a park, of a central park, of the Rizal Park. I think they kind of like go together. So I think, you know, when you talk about adaptive reuse of buildings, you're trying to introduce a more contemporary use of what may have been designed for something else in the past, but then may no longer be relevant in the present. Um, but the relationship of the buildings to the park, I think, remains the same. Now, of course, this is on the assumption that no additional buildings are being built on the park. Now, which is another issue, because we have a tendency in the Philippines to build new buildings on parks, and that contributes to the lessening of our parks and public open space, um, which I think should stop. I don't think we should be building more and more buildings on what remains uh, as our parks and open spaces. We don't have enough to begin with, and what is remaining should not be built upon. Now, in the case of the Paco station, um, that has been kind of overrun by events. And I think also the building had deteriorated beyond, really a meaningful adaptive reuse. And so I think the art is probably the only way of salvaging it and somehow sort of using that as a kind of like a monument to what it was before, because it was part of the Burnham plan. I'm not sure, however, of whether the location, the original location, is still viable for maintaining or keeping the arch there, because I understand that with the operationalization of the commuter railway, there might, if I'm not mistaken, there is a proposed station somewhere there, and so the old Paco station building might be in the way of that new railway station. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with the details of the of the site development plan itself. But what I know is that there is going to be a commuter railway, and there is a possibility that a new station will be located there, and it might affect the original, which is actually just ruins at this time.
Thank you, sir. Some of our viewers are suggesting that the translation of neighborhood is kapitbahayan. Would you agree, sir?
Actually, I coined that term. I used that term several years back because I remember kapitbahay, of course, is something that we're familiar with, and bayan, for those people who live in the provinces, Um, especially the people who live in remote areas, on weekends they would go to the bayan, which is the poblacion, to do their shopping, to do their going to the movies and etc. So luwas tayo sa bayan, di ba? So I coined the term. I used the term kapit bahayan before, um, or kapit bayanan. Um, it it's not commonly used. And we don't have a planning system similar to what they have in the U.S., where they have a neighborhood unit, a defined area with a population base, and that prescribes, if it is a population of so many, then it should have this number. It should have an elementary school of so many classrooms. It should have a high school, etc. It should have a health center. We don't have that kind of system in place. And so what we have is that there are standards that are often found in the annexes of the comprehensive land use plans of cities, that refer to, for example, the number of hospital beds per thousand population, number of policemen per thousand population. But we don't have standards for like community facilities based on a neighborhood unit system. So that's what is missing, I think. And I think it would be an interesting exercise to come up with some kind of guidelines on what is a Filipino neighborhood. By the way, when you speak of neighborhood in the Filipino sense, a Filipino neighborhood in an urban area is defined very differently in terms of space with that of a rural neighborhood. In the rural areas, the neighbor who is in the next mountain is still a neighbor, even though it takes like 2 hours or 3 hours to get to that neighbor's house. It still is a kapitbahay because that's the nearest neighbor they have. But of course, in the urban areas, ask yourselves, who do you consider your neighbor? Usually, the family on your right, the family on your left, and if the street in front of you is not very wide, maybe the family across you is also considered a neighbor. But to most urban Filipinos, the family living in the back is almost never considered a neighbor. Interesting anthropological phenomenon, but di ba? I mean, almost nobody considers the family living in the back as your neighbor. I've tried to come up with an explanation for that. It's because to Filipinos, the rear yard is the dirty side of your house. And so dirty side to dirty side becomes a barrier to social interaction. Doon ang sampayan, doon ang basurahan, doon yung mga gamit na hindi na ginagamit, di ba? So doon lahat nakatambak. So it becomes a barrier to social interaction. But when you go out of your gate or your house, you might see your neighbor to your right, to your left, and across. Now, if the street in front of you is EDSA, then you do not consider the guy across the street as a neighbor. Anyway, those are things that I think would be interesting to look at in defining what might be a Filipino neighborhood.
Thank you, sir. This one is from Fe Moselina. Are there any recent efforts by any city planning groups that have made a significant impact in their respective communities? Can you cite, sir, maybe some best practices that you know of?
Uh, well, there are a number of local governments who have been trying to improve on their planning. Um, the the improvements, I think, are kind of maybe not very major in the sense that, like for example, slums, informal settlements are still major problems, and the local governments seem to be unable to do anything about it, and even national government also seems to be unable to do anything about it. So the improvements in planning have been kind of limited to small kind of areas, uh, uh, and so they take on more a kind of uh, either a community improvement program like improving sanitation, uh, or improving um, the disaster preparedness of a neighborhood or of a barangay. Uh, in some cases, certain cities have instituted um, transparency in the preparation of city budgets. Now, you may say, how is that related to planning? The plans need to be financed, need to be funded. Otherwise, how are you going to implement the plans? Okay? So, budgeting is a very important um, government function. Now, how are the budgets prepared? And are budgets made available to the people? Can anybody look at a city budget and check on what projects are being funded by this budget? Some cities have started to put their budgets online, and so anybody or people with internet can access their budgets, the city budgets, and take a look at them. So these are some improvements that can be cited. One of the very first cities that did the online budgeting or making budgets available online was Naga City, when Jesse Robredo was mayor on Naga, uh, the husband of VP Lenny Robredo. There are a number of other cities now that have done that. I think Iloilo has done it. I think maybe Cagayan de Oro has also done it. Um, in Metro Manila, I'm not sure who else has done it. There also have been some improvements in terms of providing housing for people who are living in esteros and danger zones. One can cite the example of Valenzuela, which has developed the Disciplina Village that provides housing, affordable housing, for people who had to be relocated from disaster danger zones. So, for those who might be interested in this kind of little success stories, you can access the Galing Puok Foundation website. Galing Puok Foundation. The Galing Puok Awards are given to local governments who do innovations in the management of their cities.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is from Facebook. What are the long-term social implications of the failure to fully implement the Burnham and Frost plans? Can it be said that the failure was a major contributor to the rise of informal settlements?
The short answer is yes. The omission of both the Burnham plan and the Frost-Arellano plan, well, mainly the Burnham plan, of the problem of slums and informal settlements, perpetuated the problem that we still see up to now. The problems of the informal settlements in the Tondo, Binondo area, in the Santa Cruz, San Nicolas area. So the non-implementation of the plan in the plan of Burnham did contribute to making the situation worse. But if you take a look at the problem now, it was not really Burnham's fault. I mean, Burnham was given specific instructions to come up with a physical plan. And that's why the City Beautiful movement was what he used. The City Beautiful concept was what he used. I mean, in the US, they didn't have slums and informal settlements to deal with when they came up with plans for Washington, D.C. or Chicago or San Francisco. So, the plans that Burnham prepared were based on what the government decision makers told him to do. So it's really a responsibility of government when it boils down to that. So if the problems are the way they are right now, that's the responsibility of government.
Thank you, sir. We are actually running out of time for Q&A, but we can accommodate one last more. Our next question is from Facebook. Can you think of ways on how present urban plans and urban planning can respond to our new normal or a post-pandemic world?
Well, there are specific lessons that I think we can pick up during this pandemic. For example, in my case, I have been forced to work from home. I think many of us, maybe all of us, have been forced to work from home. Now, I have the luxury of having a garden, and so I can go outdoors without having to leave my, without having to go out of my fence, and then I can walk around and enjoy a little bit of fresh air. Now, how many people have that kind of a luxury? They're all cooped up. Now, if they are to go now, but we all also need to go out to do some chores like buy food, buy medicines. So we go out, and then we have to use the streets when we go out. Okay? Now the streets, most of our streets have been designed for motor vehicles, not for people. Okay? But now, because there is no public transportation, there's not too much traffic, a lot of people are now biking or using bicycles. But we don't have proper bike lanes. We don't have standards for bike lanes. They seem to be put up by local governments based on, some people's suggestions. Let's put it up here, let's put it up there. And there are no standards. And sometimes even the width of these bike lanes are not sufficient, are not wide enough. And also some of them are located along beside the moving lanes in roadways, and therefore are exposing the cyclists to the risk of accidents. So I think we need to, one of the things that we can look at from an urban planning, urban design point of view is how do we use our streets? Should they only be for motor vehicles or should they also be for people? Personally, I think they should be more for people. But then they are mostly designed by traffic engineers who are trained to design for motor vehicles. And so, for example, the DPWH standard for the width of one lane is 3.5 meters. That's almost 12 feet wide. A car is only not, just a little over 8 feet wide. So do you need that much space? Can't we now have narrower moving lanes and wider sidewalks so that the sidewalks can accommodate bike lanes and we can even plant more trees and landscape the sidewalk so that we don't really need, for people who don't have gardens, they can just go out to the street, to the sidewalk, and have, have a little bit of nature, have a little bit of fresh air, rather than going out to the street and being run over by a speeding motorcycle. Uh, so I think that these are some ideas that I think also that we can look at. Also, the location of where food stores are located. Right now, we have to go to a grocery to buy our food. Again, I am fortunate that there is a grocery that is within walking distance of my house. So it's convenient. Again, how many people have that kind of a convenience? Because where I live, there's a bank, there's a grocery, and there's a drugstore that are all within walking distance of my house. So at least this basic, the places where you need to go to, even during the pandemic, are easy for me to get to. But I think for a lot of people, they're not that easy. So these are some of the ideas that I think we can consider, from an urban planning and urban design point of view, lessons that we can do after this pandemic is over.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And thank you for the presentation. Now, it is unfortunate that we ran out of time for the Q&A, but for those who are genuinely interested in the topic and would like to raise further questions, feel free to email Dr. Einsiedel via this email address. So nveinsidel@gmail.com. So feel free to email our speakers for your questions. Now, sir, you recently launched a book last December 2019, Metro Manila, My City, My Home. Would you like to say something about the book po and where our viewers can buy the book?
Okay, I will have to post siguro, maybe with your help, I can post how to buy it because, I launched this in around Christmas, just before Christmas, last Christmas. And then I was negotiating with the bookstores, but then I was overrun by events and then never got to finalize it. So it's not available in bookstores, but we are making it available to people who are interested by through courier service and Gcash. The book is my kind of it's a personalized narration of my experience with the planning and development of Metro Manila. As was mentioned in the introduction, I was the Commissioner for Planning of Metro Manila for 10 years. And even before I became the Commissioner for Planning, I had been involved with Metro Manila with my work with the Development Academy of the Philippines and the Task Force on Human Settlements, where my specific assignment was Metro Manila. So I have been intimately uh, involved with the ideas. In fact, I was involved in the recommendation to create what is now the MMDA, because that was passed in the original Metro Manila government was passed in 1975. Um, I had something to do with that. And then also, even after I had left government, I continued monitoring what was happening, and I was contributing also to some of the efforts here, even though I was no longer um, with the government, but I was with the United Nations, and therefore I somehow would get involved with the things that were happening here. So this book is what I have written uh, of the experiences that I have had, which for those of you who may be taking up courses in urban planning, you will not see what I've written here in textbooks. What I've written here are kind of like behind the scenes struggle of how to remain in government when everybody is trying to get you out. Uh, because I had some ideas which some people did not like. So that's about what the book. That's about the book, and I'll just post later on how it can be bought. As I said, through Gmail and courier service.
Thank you so much, sir. And later, the Intramuros Administration Facebook page will share the post of our speaker on how to buy the book. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
And then, before we end this episode, I'd like to share our social media channels. So the Intramuros Administration is available in Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. So feel free to follow us for updates. And for those who missed this episode or for those who came in late, do not worry because this episode will be uploaded later in our YouTube channel. So just key in Intramuros Administration or go to bit.ly/IAILS in all caps. So go to that link and make sure to subscribe to our channel. And let me take this opportunity as well to promote our other online page, the Google Arts and Culture page of the Intramuros Administration. Just key in Intramuros Administration to view our digitized museum collection online. So people may not be able to visit our museums now, but you can view our collections through your computer. So just key in Intramuros Administration via Google Arts and Culture. Now I'd also like to promote our talks, our succeeding talks next week. So next week, Friday, August 14 at 3 p.m., we're going to have a talk by Nina Inyon on Leoncio Asuncion iconology and the 19th century Philippine colonial religious sculpture. So we're going to focus on 19th century religious sculpture on Friday. And the following day, on Saturday, August 15 at 3 p.m., we will have Dr. Karin Santillan from the University of Santo Tomas, who will talk about the architecture of Intramuros. Her title is Looking at Layers, a Reassessment of Built Heritage in Intramuros. Before we end this episode, Dr. Einsiedel, would you like to say some final words?
No, I think I've spoken enough. So thank you very much for having invited me and for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts about the Burnham and Frost-Arellano plan. I'd be happy to share some more of my ideas about urban planning if you're interested in the future.
Thank you, sir. And thank you to our speakers, and thank you to all our viewers for today. Watch out for our next episodes on Friday and on Saturday. Thank you so much. And for now, good afternoon and bye for now.
Bye.
Thank you, sir.